The general public were encouraged to go all out for victory during World War II, with an advert in the Wiltshire Gazette announcing, "I save everything I can for my local salvage campaign: paper, metal, bones, food scraps. I save gas, electricity, coal, paraffin and water. I save money wherever possible and put it into war savings. I spend every ounce of energy and every minute I can on war-winning work. I help local voluntary organisations and, if I can, I dig for victory. I know that everyone, including myself, can do something." Anthony Eden broadcasted an appeal at 9 p.m. on the 14th of May 1940, his very first as Secretary of State for War, asking for volunteers for what was initially called the Local Defence Corps. Some volunteers arrived at police stations before the broadcast had ended, and throughout the county, police stations were besieged by telephone calls and callers. In Chippenham, amongst the first to enlist was the landlord of the Little George and a worker from the Westinghouse factory. And still the men came in. In 3 days, excluding Salisbury, the number mounted to 3,754. The headquarters of the Devisers platoon was at South Broome School, as seen here. The Home Guard defended communication routes, such as railway bridges and junctions, plus factory buildings. And here is the Swindon No. 1 anti-tank gun detachment, based at the GWR works. The Home Guard took part in drills, parades and demonstrations, undertook training and simulated invasions with soldiers, fire guards and members of the WWII Housewives Service. All had their day jobs. Some, such as farmers, worked long hours in the fields, were dropped off at their Home Guard posts by their wives, only to be picked up again after a shift to get very little sleep and begin the day over. It was the job of the Home Guard to remove all signposts under the Removal of Direction Signs Order 1940. This is one of the piles of signposts gathered from around Chippenham. Wiltshire's iconic landmarks, such as the White Horses, were also camouflaged for the duration of the war. Branches were held in place with wire netting. Social events were important, with dances and sports events organised for members of the Home Guard. The B Company of the 5th Swindon Battalion performed the play 0 Hour on 26th of January 1944. A local newspaper reported it as providing such lubricant in the liveliest manner for a large and enthusiastic audience at the Commonweal School. There were also the stop lines, created along natural waterways, making the most of topographical features wherever possible to create anti-tank obstacles and defence posts. The second line of defence was to be roadblocks, manned by the Home Guard. Pillboxes were built, like this one, beside the River Avon just outside Chippenham, and anti-tank obstacles like this near the Kennet and Avon Canal. In 1943, women were allowed to become Home Guards, but only in an auxiliary capacity, and they could only wear a plastic badge to define their role. Their job would be to perform non-combatant duties such as clerical work, cooking and driving, but it was a useful and necessary one. This photograph shows members of the Trowbridge platoon. The Housewives Service was being formed by the WWII in every town and village in Wiltshire. Their presence would provide additional assistance in the community. They could supply water for stirrup pumps, shelter the wounded or homeless, supply hot water for drinks, look after invalids, children or the elderly, direct people to rest centres and first aid points, or assist in gas cleansing. Cards were issued in January 1943 to be placed in the windows of WVS members. Street representatives, usually a member of the Housewives Service, would be the focal point of all WVS activities in that area. Each parish was required to produce its own plan to put into effect in the time of invasion, and these form the basis of what became known as parish war books. Some, like this one for Chalderton, contained maps locating strategic buildings and facilities. They would form a vital part of the civilian organisation for the defence of the country against invasion. Included in them was provision for casualties, emergency feeding arrangements, organisation for labour, tools and transport, supplementary drinking water supplies, additional rest centre accommodation, arrangements for the supply of messengers, gas cleansing services and more. The Red Cross Women's Voluntary Aid Detachment gave full-time service in hospitals, convalescent homes, in ambulances and on trains. They offered their spare time voluntarily at the Air Raid Precautions First Aid Post, many also serving with the local Red Cross ambulances too. The Cricklade Red Cross volunteers used their ambulance to help ferry casualties from RAF Blake Hill, a casualty clearing station. The ambulance was a converted saloon vehicle. Volunteers received a knock on the door, mainly at night, often around 3 a.m, with an estimated time of arrival. The call was never turned down, as it would give the RAF personnel a much-needed break. These members of the VAD are from Bradford-on-Avon. Air Raid Precautions wardens conducted regular gas mask checks, and there were often drills at school, with children enjoying the opportunity to make whoopee cushion noises in them. They were horrible to wear, smelling of disinfectant and rubber, and it was hard to breathe in them too. One Wiltshire resident wrote to the Wiltshire Gazette, "No one wants those things dangling across the shoulder. The poor children who are supposed to carry them everywhere are to be pitied." Bombs were dropped on the county, such as these in Lee Road, Westbury, in October 1940. Most were accidental, the bomb crew offloading them on their return to Germany. Others were aimed at targets, such as the GWR works in Swindon and the RAF fields, like that at Hallavington, but missed their targets, falling on civilian premises instead. Starfish decoy sites were set up to draw enemy bombers away from the real targets, such as one at Minety, which was bombed on Good Friday, 1941. On a farm near Chippenham in August 1941. We had been harvesting that day, and a long trailer of sacked up wheat had been left on the field at the end of the day. At about 11:30, we heard the approach of an enemy aircraft and suddenly realised we were being bombed. There were fires starting in the fields all round the farm, and a number of large bombs had exploded. I suddenly found myself blown from my seat across to the door of the room. We all went bravely outside and found there seemed to be fires everywhere. We rather pathetically tried to put some out with the buckets of water, but it was hopeless. The following day there was a broadcast by the Germans to say that Hallavington Aerodrome, about 1 mile away from the farm, had been almost completely destroyed. The part-time fire service auxiliaries did 1 night on duty, 1 on call and 1 free. The AFS teams were issued with pumps, but not the vehicles with which to tow them. Many had to make do by borrowing or purchasing any type of vehicle they could get. The Salisbury AFS met up on Skew Bridge. The Green Goddesses all lined up before setting off to Southampton to help when it was being blitzed. The Warminster National Fire Service was sent to Bristol and Plymouth during the blitzes to aid the beleaguered crews. And civil defence workers from Purton travelled as far as Coventry and London to offer their aid. Fire guards, whose job it was to protect homes and businesses from fire spreading, could find it hard to work a full day and then go on duty, some having volunteered with the Home Guard too, and some suffering illness. These AFS workers were based in Bradford-on-Avon. By September 1939, 17,000 had enrolled with the Women's Land Army nationally. This first winter was wet and then hard, and the girls had no uniforms as yet, but they refused to give in to the elements, keeping their feet warm by stuffing their gumboots with hay. Many were drawn to the land army by the thought of freedom and open air, and by mid-1941, members of the WLA had reached 20,000. After conscription was introduced, its ranks swelled to over 80,000. This image shows a photographer taking a film of a land girl in a Wiltshire field for propaganda purposes to help maintain morale. Volunteer agricultural camps were set up, supervised and organised by the land girls. The volunteers travelled to the camps and spent their holidays working on the fields, lending a hand on the land. Like these volunteers, stationed at a camp near Malmesbury, which was visited by Queen Mary. One way that civilians could legally supplement their diet and help the war effort was by digging for victory. The Board of Agriculture gave the go-ahead to increase the number of allotments, and everyone who had a garden was digging it up for the war effort. Any piece of land could be used, even railway cuttings, and factory workers tended crops at the workplace alongside children at school. The countryside itself was a resource. Children went out picking all sorts of herbs and berries. Wiltshire people spent their time digging for victory in addition to many other duties, such as civil defence volunteering, after a long day at work or after hours spent queuing for shopping and then trying to come up with interesting meals based on the rations and supplies they had managed to acquire. One way to provide nutrition during the war was through communal feeding, whereby needy and vulnerable groups could be guaranteed a nutritional meal. Winston Churchill was not impressed with the term communal feeding and wrote to Lord Wilton, the Minister of Food, "I hope the term communal feeding centres is not going to be adopted. It is an odious expression, suggestive of communism and the workhouse. I suggest you call them British restaurants. Everybody associates the word restaurant with a good meal, and they may as well have the name if they cannot get anything else." British restaurants also help factory workers who often found it hard to get a cooked meal, and lodgers and evacuees who found it difficult to get a meal at their lodgings. Local cooking depots were used to supply meals to schools and other establishments who required it. Rationing was designed to stop the food shortages, high prices and queues seen during the First World War, and importantly, used in conjunction with price control to provide fair access for all and to guarantee a certain standard of nutrition for the whole population. Fresh eggs were particularly hard to come by during the war for those who did not live in rural areas and were highly desirable black market items. The government tried to help provide them in a different form due to their high nutritional content, and cooks were given instructions on how to use them. With limited resources, cooks had to make the most of the rations they had, and there were recipes to help, such as this one for patriotic soup by the British Growers Publicity Council in 1941. Conscription for women was introduced in December 1941. Many young single women found themselves in factories across the country, but many local women with children also undertook war work. Finding someone to look after their children could be difficult, as were the hours. One war factory worker in Wiltshire worked 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. shifts and only saw her children when they were asleep. Spitfire production was undertaken at a number of locations in Wiltshire, based within a 780-mile radius of the Vickers Supermarine Works in Hampshire. They also had to be near an aerodrome, like that at Keevil, for assembly and flight testing. Factories were located in Southwick, as seen here, and Trowbridge, and at small satellite factories such as the Wilson Dorset Motor Company and Anna Valley Motors in Salisbury. At Southwick, they worked from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. One female worker recalled that, "We'd done a bit of everything. When we went to Southwick first, we were making wings for Spitfires. We had the ribs and we made the whole wing." The royal family did much to boost morale during the war, and Queen Mary visited Wiltshire many times. She was living at Badminton for the duration, and wanted to be photographed among my people. One such visit was to Hayden's in Trowbridge. This photograph shows her arriving. Wiltshire was told to expect 15,000 evacuees in September 1939. The Women's Voluntary Service had undertaken a survey and found that bedding and furniture was in short supply. Donations were asked for. The government put in orders, but they were delayed. 2 boys evacuated with the West Kensington Central School to Melksham arrived at Melksham Station from London Paddington on 2nd of September 1939. They had with them their suitcases, gas masks, an issue of chocolates in bags handed out before the journey. They were taken around door to door, visiting potential foster parents to see if they would take them in. This photograph shows some of the arrivals at Trowbridge Station. One Cricklade resident, only a small child himself at the time, vividly remembers another young evacuee who had said goodbye to his mother at Paddington Station. He stood in the courtyard, holding his teddy bear, crying. I was only little myself, but I felt for him. City children were unfamiliar with the countryside, and it was arranged for some Trowbridge evacuees to visit a nearby farm. The writer Fay Inchthorne noted in Freshford, when the village was almost deserted again, when the little houses and big houses had only their own families to shelter, there was a distinct feeling of relief. But there was something else as well. The village felt a disposition to recall the good points of the departed guests. It had been a time of revelation and heart-searching. The government had asked a really hard thing. It is not easy to share one's own fireside indefinitely with anybody, but those who are least able, so it seemed, were the ones most willing to show the true Samaritan spirit. In that season of testing, our village, so easily moved to compassion and also impatience, learned lessons which we could not have been learned in any other way. By the 31st of December 1939, 1.5 million men were in the military services and 43,000 women had joined the Wrens, ATS, WAFs and nursing services. The county was home to both established and new airfields and army bases, with all the additional personnel, traffic and noise that came with them. One pioneering job was detailed to those WAFs who joined as nursing orderlies. A small group soon found themselves being trained for travel to France just after the D-Day landings. They were to become flying nightingales, travelling to the continent and caring for the casualties who were flown back. On the way, sitting out amongst the bombs with their medical panniers. Edna Birbeck, pictured here, was on the first flight of its kind to leave Britain from RAF Blake Hill near Cricklade. She flew 60 casualty operations and, despite the severity of injuries, none of her patients ever died on any of her flights. Edna remembered that the men always wanted to hear when they were over the coast. She would let them know and would say, "It won't be long before you're home," and they'd cheer. Military personnel from many different countries came to Wiltshire during World War II. In fact, so many trained or assembled on Salisbury Plain that it became known as the United Nations. But the overwhelming invasion began in January 1942. By the end of the war, almost 3 million US servicemen had visited Britain, their numbers peaking at 228,000 in the spring and summer of 1942. The GI in our photo here was stationed at Fontainebleau House, Westbury. The arrival of US troops has since become known as the Friendly Invasion. The arrival of soldiers to Freshford on the Wiltshire-Somerset border in the winter of 1939 was marked by a great clattering and rumbling of lorries, full of merry-faced lads in battle dress, going full speed ahead down the precipitous roadway, which abounds in concealed turnings and cantankerous corners, and for a great part of the way has no footpath. Damage to houses were particularly noted at the corners of crossroads in the county. Hinton's War Memorial stood near the road crossing at the square and was knocked down by a runaway tank. It careered across the road junction, knocked down the memorial, maybe 4 trees and a water standpipe, finally coming to rest against another tree. The tank in this photograph became stuck in a country lane near Nook. The county surveyor was called out and photographed the scene. In Wiltshire, great use was made of prisoners of war as the supply of labour in agriculture was an ongoing problem. Italians were put to work on the land first, with Germans following in 1944 from camps. They worked in mobile gangs, and 500 individuals were placed as resident workers on farms by 1944. Number 114 camp at Edenvale, Westbury, pictured here, was of the standard type, situated on a site that was also occupied by housing. On the ridge near Hindon, POWs of different nationalities worked in the sawmills. The difference in their arrival at the site typified the differences in their culture. When the Italians arrived, they drifted up the hill in 2s and 3s, with the rifle of the British pioneer corporal in charge of them being carried by one of them. When it was the turn of the Germans, they formed themselves up under their own command and marched up as a squad. In Wiltshire, Italians were being withdrawn from their billets in March 1946, and German POWs took over, like these here, based near Corsham. Some of the POWs got to know Wiltshire residents very well, writing to them after they had returned home to the continent. Fundraising was an important part of the war effort, but took a lot of organising. Melksham's War Weapons Week typically consisted of many subcommittees for schools, street savings, war bonds, works, selling centres, publicity and propaganda, entertainment and processions, all reporting to the Executive Committee. This image is of Trowbridge during War Weapons Week. This poster was sent out to local communities for their Wings for Victory campaign, March to June 1943. The drive would provide a great opportunity for the British people to give some expression to their admiration for the Royal Air Force. The committees were told that the financial objective of the campaign is to increase savings and investment in government securities, but above all, we must make it a tribute to the dauntless heroism of the Royal Air Force, to those who won the Battle of Britain, and to those who are still winning it for us every day. The Melksham Committee were commended by the Air Vice Marshal in April 1943 as the sum they had raised, almost £114,000, had well beaten their target of £75,000 and must easily constitute a per capita record for almost any town in England. The presentation of the plaque took place on the Town Hall steps on 30th of October 1943. A certificate of honour was given to Durrington Church of England Junior School in recognition of their special achievement during the Wins for Victory National Savings Campaign of 1943. On 30th of April 1945, the Home Office was writing to Wiltshire County Council's clerk regarding plans to mark the celebration of the termination of organised hostilities in Europe. The government wanted local authorities to begin making local arrangements, understanding that although the war was not yet won, the general public would wish to celebrate the victorious end of the European campaigns before turning with renewed energy to the completion of the tasks before it. VE Day was announced by the Prime Minister at 3 p.m. on Tuesday, the 8th of May, 1945. The whole of Tuesday and Wednesday were organised as public holidays. The towns of Wiltshire thronged with joyous crowds, and buildings were adorned with bunting and the flags of many nations. Floodlights were put into position. There were electric illuminations, and lanterns were strung in the trees or across rivers, creating a fairy tale scene for children who in many cases had never seen lights outside at night before. There were bonfires, and free ice creams were given to the children in Salisbury. And it's Salisbury you can see in the photograph here. There had been 6 years of sacrifice and hardship by the British population, and both the government and the royal family wanted to relay their thanks. King George VI sent this message to the children of the land, and what became the Victory Parade, a national celebration of victory on the 8th of June 1946. Today, as we celebrate victory, I send this personal message to you and all other boys and girls at school, for you have shared in the hardships and dangers of a total war, and you have shared no less in the triumph of the Allied nations. I know you will always feel proud to belong to a country which was capable of such supreme effort, proud too of parents and elder brothers and sisters who by their courage, endurance and enterprise brought victory. May these qualities be yours as you grow up and join in the common effort to establish among the nations of the world unity and peace.